Welcome to Dr. Conjuring's bone-chilling horror stories, where the terror feels too real to be fiction. Before we dive into tonight's story, make sure to grab your headphones. Trust me, you'll want the full experience. These stories are designed to be felt, not just heard, and the darkness is best experienced with your eyes closed. We don't always need a screen to frighten you. Sometimes it's just the sound that creeps under your skin. So sit back, close your eyes, and let the horror take hold. Emily had spent years working tirelessly, building her career, putting in long hours. She'd never taken a real holiday, always telling herself she'd do it later. No tropical getaways, no weeks on a beach, just work. She had never booked that cruise she always dreamed about, convinced it wasn't the right time. But now, at last, everything was different. After all the hustle and bustle, she finally took the plunge. She booked the vacation of a lifetime, a week-long cruise across the Caribbean. Her cabin was exactly what she imagined, a spacious room with a view of the endless ocean, a bed so comfortable she thought she could sleep for days. The first night on board felt like a dream. The ship was alive with energy, laughter and music spilling from the upper decks. The warm sea breeze carried the faint scent of salt and tropical fruit. The lights on the deck sparkled like 1,000 stars, casting a magical glow across the water. Emily dressed up for the occasion, wearing a little black dress and heels that clicked as she walked toward the party happening on the top deck. She was free. Finally, no deadlines, no stress. She danced with strangers, joined in on the revelry, and laughed as she clinked glasses with her fellow passengers. Smoke from cigars swirled in the air as people chatted and partied until the early hours of the morning. It was everything she had imagined: fun, laughter, and a sense of pure bliss. She even made new friends. Everyone was having a blast. But the night was still young when everything began to unravel. After hours of dancing and mingling, Emily stepped out onto the balcony of her cabin, hoping to get some fresh air. The moon cast a silver glow on the water, and the sounds of the party drifted faintly below. She breathed deeply, taking it all in. This was the break she'd deserved. As she leaned on the handrail, her body relaxed, almost floating with the gentle sway of the ship. But in the blink of an eye, everything changed. The handrail beneath her palm was slick, too slick. Emily's balance faltered for a fraction of a second, and that was all it took. Her feet slipped, her hand missed the rail, and she was falling. The world tilted. There was no time to scream, no time to do anything. The wind whistled past her ears as she plunged into the freezing water below. The impact was brutal. Falling from a height of approximately 10 stories, Emily hit the water at an estimated speed of 40 miles per hour. Her body slammed into the ocean's surface with a bone-jarring force, sending a shockwave of pain through her spine and limbs. For a moment, everything went black. Her head spun, her vision blurred as her body, like a rag doll, was thrust into the abyss below. The ocean swallowed her whole. The pressure around her chest intensified as she plummeted deeper into the cold, unforgiving depths. It was like sinking into a void, the water so thick it felt as though it could crush her. Panic surged through her veins as she realized the depth she had fallen into. She'd been pushed down at least 10 meters. The blow was enough to send her spiraling downward, with no sense of direction, no sense of anything. Her limbs flailed, but her body felt heavy, unresponsive, as though the water itself was holding her captive. The taste of salt flooded her mouth as she struggled to swallow, the cold seeping into her lungs. She kicked with all her might, but it felt like the more she struggled, the farther away the surface became. She couldn't hear anything, only the deafening silence that came with being so deep, so utterly alone. Her lungs burned, each second dragging her closer to the point of no return. But then, light! A dim flicker, faint and far away. The surface. With the last ounce of strength she had, she pushed her arms downward, kicking with desperation, trying to propel herself back toward the top. Her body was numb, her breath shallow, but she fought, kicking, clawing at the water, each movement slow and exhausting. The surface was a distant dream, but she couldn't give in now. Her vision began to swim with blackness as the pressure on her chest mounted. The cold was relentless, her muscles stiffening with each passing second. But just when she thought she could go no further, her hand broke the surface. The sweet rush of air filled her lungs, the cold salt water splashing against her face. Her head broke through the waves with a gasp of relief, her body shaking uncontrollably as she gulped down air, as though it was the first breath she'd ever taken. She was back at the surface just in time, but the nightmare was far from over. The sudden deceleration caused her body to jerk violently, and the cold shock of the ocean enveloped her instantly. The force of the fall left her disoriented, her limbs aching from the impact. She gasped for air, but the water was cold and dense, making it hard to breathe. Her body screamed in protest, and she struggled to orient herself in the dark, churning sea. The initial shock of the fall was overwhelming. The cold water gripped her like a vice, stealing her breath and making her limbs feel heavy and unresponsive. Her heart pounded in her chest, and panic began to set in. She tried to swim, but her muscles were stiff and uncooperative. The waves tossed her around, disorienting her further. She couldn't see anything, just darkness and the endless expanse of the ocean. As she struggled to stay afloat, Emily realized how deep she had fallen. The ship was a distant memory, its lights barely visible above. She was alone, surrounded by the vast, empty ocean. The cold seeped into her bones, and she felt the first pangs of hypothermia setting in. Her teeth chattered uncontrollably, and her limbs began to tremble. She knew she had to keep moving, but her body was betraying her. Minutes ticked by, each one heavier than the last. Emily's limbs burned with exhaustion as she fought to stay afloat. Her vision blurred with the cold. The waves tossed her around, making it harder to keep her head above water. Panic clawed at her chest, but she knew she had to stay calm. She had no choice. The ship was fading into the distance, its silhouette barely discernible against the dark horizon. Emily strained her eyes, clinging to the faint memory of its warmth and safety. The lights that once seemed a beacon of hope were now swallowed by the vastness of the sea, flickering like distant stars too far away to touch. Her heart raced, each thundering beat a desperate plea for salvation, but the indifferent waves drowned out her cries. Her throat burned raw from shouting into the night, but the wind carried her voice away, scattering it into nothingness. The icy grip of the water clung to her body, seeping through her clothes and biting into her skin. The shock of the cold made her chest tighten, her breath shallow and rapid. Her muscles spasmed in protest, but instinct forced her to keep moving, kicking, paddling, fighting the pull of the relentless waves. The cold was a living thing, wrapping around her like chains, heavy and merciless. Each breath tasted sharp and metallic, as though the ocean itself had invaded her lungs. She tried to steady herself, but the water was a force of chaos, tugging at her legs and swirling around her like unseen hands determined to drag her under. Her limbs grew sluggish, and panic surged through her veins. The bitter truth settled into her mind. She was losing control. Her body was no longer hers. It was a trembling, disobedient vessel at the mercy of the frigid sea. Time blurred into an endless stretch of cold and darkness. Was it minutes, or had an eternity passed since she had fallen from the ship? Her teeth chattered violently, and her fingers had gone numb, stiff and unresponsive. She tried to paddle, but her arms felt like lead, weighed down by exhaustion and the relentless chill. Cold water shock had already taken hold, her breathing erratic and shallow, her heart thudding in a frantic rhythm as her body struggled to adjust. Emily's thoughts became disjointed, fragments of fear and memory tangled in a fog of hypothermia. The stars above twisted and blurred, and the horizon seemed to dance in strange, impossible patterns. The ocean wasn't just water, it was a living entity, vast and uncaring, surrounding her, swallowing her whole. Her vision dimmed, the edges fading to black as exhaustion threatened to consume her. But she couldn't let go. Not yet. She knew the fact's cold water was merciless. It could steal your breath within seconds, rob you of muscle control in mere minutes, and drag you into hypothermia's cold embrace within half an hour. Her body was failing her, but she clung to the stubborn will to survive, even as the sea whispered promises of release. The ship was gone, the lights extinguished, leaving only the vast, empty void of the ocean. Emily's breath shuddered as she fought to stay afloat, her body trembling violently, muscles refusing to obey. The cold gnawed at her, deep and relentless, but somewhere within her, a flicker of defiance remained. Surrender was easy, survival was harder, and Emily wasn't ready to give in, not yet. His shimmering glow on the horizon pulsed weakly, a fragile beacon in the vast void of the sea. Emily's frozen limbs jerked in agonizing spasms as she struggled toward it. Each breath she drew tasted bitter with salt, searing her throat as though the ocean itself clawed its way inside her. Her cracked lips trembled with desperation. The glow flickered and blurred through her salt-stung eyes, but this time it didn't fade into nothingness. The faint outline of the cruise ship glimmered in the distance. Emily's chest tightened with fragile hope, but her body was betraying her. Severe hypothermia had dulled her senses, making every movement agonizingly slow and clumsy. She kicked feebly against the water, gasping for air between the relentless waves. The glow remained steady, and for a moment Emily's fractured mind clung to the hope that the ship had returned for her. The engines had reversed course, she convinced herself, and they were scanning the water for any sign of her. "I just need to hold on," she whispered hoarsely, her voice swallowed by the wind and waves. The light seemed closer now, illuminating a patch of sea that shimmered like liquid silver. Emily's lips curled into a weak smile. She imagined herself being pulled onto the ship's deck, wrapped in warm blankets, surrounded by faces filled with concern. Her limbs, driven by sheer desperation, thrashed against the icy water. Every fiber of her being fought to reach that light. But as she drew closer, her heart sank with crushing realization. The light wasn't from the ship at all. It was the cold reflection of the distant moon shimmering off the restless waves. There was no ship, no rescue, just the vast, unyielding ocean. Despair clamped around her chest, heavier than the water dragging her down. Her body convulsed as another wave broke over her head. Salt water surged into her mouth and down her throat, burning like acid as it filled her lungs. Emily convulsed violently, her body instinctively rejecting the intrusion. She thrashed wildly, her arms flailing against the relentless weight of the sea. Her chest heaved in agony, muscles tightening as she fought a losing battle to expel the brine. The surface seemed impossibly distant now, warped shards of moonlight glimmering above her. She sank deeper, her body no longer buoyant as seawater weighed her down. Emily's eyes widened in terror as she saw the shimmering surface pulling farther and farther away. The moonlight dimmed, fading into a murky blur. Her lungs burned, desperate for oxygen, but all that remained was cold darkness. Her body, driven by primal instinct, resisted even as consciousness slipped away. Her arms and legs spasmed weakly, but the weight of the sea was merciless. The crushing cold numbed her senses until she could no longer tell where her body ended and the ocean began. The moonlight above faded completely, and Emily's vision dissolved into shadow. Her body trembled one last time before going limp, sinking deeper into the abyss until she vanished into the cold, eternal darkness. By the time search crews were dispatched, it was already too late. They combed the vast expanse of the sea, their lights piercing through the waves in desperate arcs. But there was no trace of Emily, just endless, indifferent water. What the crew didn't say aloud, but knew too well, was that many who fall overboard are never found. The ocean keeps its secrets. Bodies lost at sea face a grim fate. Within a week or two, putrefaction and scavenging creatures dismember the corpse. The bones, stripped bare, sink slowly to the seabed, where they are either buried by marine silt or broken down over months or years, depending on the acidity of the water. Emily had become one with the sea, a fleeting memory swallowed by the abyss. That was tonight's chilling tale from Dr. Conjuring's channel. If it sent shivers down your spine, please give us a like. It's completely free and helps us share these eerie stories with more brave souls like you. And if you're craving even more bone-chilling horror that will haunt your nights, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. You'll never miss a new upload, each story more terrifying than the last, delivered straight to your inbox. Thank you so much for listening. We truly appreciate every one of you. Good night. And remember, sleep with one eye open. You never know what might be watching. Ha ha.